This is a course on contemporary South Asia. So what I'm going to do is give you some general contours of the course. I will, of course, discuss the requirements and other administrative aspects related to how we're going to run the course. And then I'm going to go over the syllabus in some detail with you. But before I do that, let me just begin with some general observations on the parameters of this course. Okay? So South Asia is a region of the world that is comprised of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, a country that almost no one has heard of, and the Maldives, which is a small group of islands. This course will not cover Afghanistan, and there's a long historical explanation which I won't enter into at the moment. In part, it has to do with the organization of knowledge, and it has to do with how the region called South Asia really was carved out as an area of study. So in India, for example, in the 19th century, no one referred to that part of the world as South Asia. I think that's the first thing all of you should recognize and try to understand the implications. And of course, I'm going to help you think through the implications of that. Because when we think of the world as made up of regions called the Middle East, or South Asia, or North Africa, some of these are basically regions that became as objects of study only so in the post-World War II period. And the post-World War II period is characterized by the American domination of the world. There's just no other way to put it. The American domination of the world in every sphere of life. And with respect to popular culture, with respect to political domination, with respect to the fact that the US, of course, was the dominant and paramount economic power for several decades, and still is, notwithstanding everything you've heard about the competition from China and all of that, it still is the paramount power. And when you're the paramount power, you also shape how you're going to study the world. So South Asia is a region of the world that does not define itself as South Asia. It's been defined by someone else. All right? So that's the first set of observations that we, I think, have to be attentive to when we're thinking about this entity called South Asia. Now, South Asia, this course is focused on 1947 to the present day. 47 because that's the year when India acquired its independence from the British after 2 centuries of colonial rule. So we are not going to look at the period of colonial rule, but notwithstanding the parameters of 47 to the present day, colonialism enters into the picture. And it enters into the picture for lots of reasons. For example, the entire political structure inherited by India and Pakistan really owes everything to the colonial period. The fact that India has a parliamentary system, the fact that Indians like myself growing up in middle-class families all became fluent in English, owes everything to the colonial period, right? The newspapers, the major newspapers in the English language that you find in that part of the world all commenced publication during the colonial period. There are a few exceptions, of course. But if you look at the newspaper called The Hindu, you know, it's a newspaper that has a storied past, goes back to 150 years. You look at the Times of India. Newspapers such as those were all newspapers that commenced publication at that time. There are thousands of other ways in which colonialism inserts itself into the post-1947 period. But we're not going to be looking at British rule in India. That's not the subject of the course. All right? The subject of the course really is, as I said, 47 down to the present day. So now there are a few more general observations that I want you to think about. Let me go back to what I started with, that is Afghanistan. Now, there's a history of long contacts between India and Afghanistan. You know, in the American press, particularly after the September 11th bombings, the dominant representation of Afghanistan was of this wild, savage country. And the Afghans as some kind of wild Pathans running around, you know, shooting up people, abusing their women. That was a dominant image. But I have to tell you, as a historian of India, among other things, that if you look at, for example, the period from the 13th century to the 16th century, North India was ruled by Afghan kings. It's a long history of contact between that part of the world and India. But we're not covering Afghanistan because one of the things that happened is that in the post-World War II period, when this idea of South Asia came about, Afghanistan fell through the cracks. By which I mean that the people who worked on the Middle East, and you know, when you work on the Middle East, you're working, among other things, on the Islamic world. Right? Not just the Arab world, because Iran is also part of the Islamic world, and Iran, of course, is not an Arab country, right? And from their standpoint, Afghanistan was not part of the Arab world, of course. Iran was the exception in any case, but the rest of it was basically the Arab world. And there was also this sense that, well, you know, again, that the Pathans are kind of wild. So when I'm speaking about the Pathans, also known as the Pashtuns, that's the largest group, really, that you find, ethnic group that you find in modern-day Afghanistan. So Afghanistan fell through the cracks because neither South Asia nor the Middle East, as two areas of study, included Afghanistan. And I am not exaggerating when I say that when the September 11th bombings took place, in the entire American military establishment and surveillance establishment, overseas surveillance establishment, so I'm including military intelligence, I'm including the CIA, I'm including the State Department, there was only one person who knew Pashto in this entire country, in that establishment, right? Because no one really had studied Afghanistan. They were the anthropologists, but they were not involved in military intelligence for the most part, or working for the State Department, and they were, even those were really a handful, frankly. And South Asia was essentially shaped, as an object of study, was really shaped by American considerations and geopolitical considerations. And that had to do with a number of considerations such as language families, whether Afghanistan had always been viewed as part of that part of the world. And of course, I'm saying to you that there was a historical link, a long historical link. And you know, of course, that the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan has been a long-standing problem. So you can see that there might be a logic in including Afghanistan, but certainly it was not included in American understandings of South Asian studies, which doesn't mean that we are obliged to accept the American understanding, far from that, but it would introduce a lot more complications into the picture, and so we're essentially working with, at least in that sense, the conventional understanding of what is South Asia. Secondly, this course will be focused mainly on India. And there are lots of reasons for that, but there are two reasons that I want to put out right at the outset. You know, because for all I know, there might be a Nepali or a Bangladeshi or a Pakistani in the room, and they might think to themselves, well, you know, at the end of 10 weeks, there were really not much discussion of Pakistan. So I'm just alerting you beforehand. And that's not because I don't think that, obviously, that these countries don't deserve our attention. That's not the issue. The issue is basically twofold. One, that the complexity of India is already so astronomical that to now bring in Sri Lanka, which went through a civil war, one of the most brutal civil wars, which ended officially. We're going to have a segment on Sri Lanka, though, right? You'll see later on. But officially it ended, 10 years ago. But to understand that civil war, we could have a whole course just on that. Right? And I'm saying to you that the complexity of India is enough for us to think about that at this point I don't want you to be detained by thinking about Nepal, Bhutan, all of that. But I will be bringing in elements from the rest of South Asia into my discussions. And secondly, there is no question whatsoever that the literature on India is much richer and much more interesting than the literature that we have on Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, and other parts of South Asia. Right? So I want you to be aware of these constraints beforehand, before we even launch into a discussion of India and all of that. And thirdly, before I get into discussing more mundane matters such as requirements and other mechanics involved with running the course, I think it is useful to reflect on something right at the outset, namely that this is what you might describe as one of the oldest parts of the world. The city of Varanasi, more colloquially known and better known as Banaras, for the South Asianists in this room might be aware. But the city of Varanasi was described by Mark Twain, who did travel to India and wrote a wonderful account in the 19th century, was described by him as the oldest inhabited city in the world, right? In North India. South Asia is also home to the largest population of at least 4 religious groups. At least 4. Hindus, the vast bulk of Hindus, of course, live in South Asia and India and Nepal. Muslims, that comes as a huge surprise to most people. Because, when you think of Islam, what do you think of immediately? You think of the Middle East. You think of Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, all of that. Well, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh put together have more Muslims than the Middle East. All right? And you don't hear much about them. And you also don't hear much about them because in the United States, more broadly in the West, I would say, but particularly in the United States, the overwhelming impression is that, if you're thinking about the Muslim world, it means the Middle East. Well, that actually is an idea that needs to be dismissed at the outset, because we're also going to, I hope, arrive at an understanding of the fact that South Asian Islam is quite different from the Islam of the Middle East, and that the history of Muslims in South Asia is also a very different history. And in some respects, at least based on my politics, it's a more promising history, a much more interesting history in some respects, right? Because it's a history of 2 very large groups of people, and for the moment we're just viewing them as homogeneous for the sake of argument. They're not homogeneous. The word Hindu, for example, was never used by a Hindu to describe herself or himself before the 18th century, even though it is usually described as the oldest religion in the world. Right? That, again, is a colonial artifact. The fact that we speak of these millions of people who are Vaishnavas or Shaktos or Shaivites as Hindus. Right? But for the sake of argument, for the sake of convenience, let's say we've got a population of 850 million Hindus in India, 900, and then you have, some in Nepal, right? And we view them as a homogeneous entity for the moment. And then we view the 600 million Muslims in South Asia. So roughly, for the sake of convenience, again, 200 million each in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, right? That these 2 communities, viewed in the singular, have inhabited that same space for well over 1,000 years. Let's not forget that. And then you also have the largest population of Sikhs and the largest population of Jains. These are religions, Jainism and Sikhism, in the world. Right? And yet the irony, of course, is that if you're looking at it from the point of view of the nation state, then this is a relatively young part of the world. Because India only became a nation state in 1947, as did Pakistan, when Pakistan was carved out of India in 1947, and then Bangladesh was carved out of Pakistan in 1971, following the War of 1971. Right, so I would like you to mull over these general considerations and some of these ironies as we go along in the course, and some of them the meaning of all of this will become more clear as we move along. All right, now let me get on to some practical matters. All right, this is an upper division class, and there are no TAs for this, and there's no discussion section. So we obviously have only these 2 meetings every week on a Tuesday and Thursday. I have long taken the view, I've taught here since 1993, I have never taken attendance, and I certainly don't intend to take it today or tomorrow or at any point, because as far as I'm concerned, you all left school some time ago, and I left it a very long time ago, and to me that is the sort of thing you do in the school, not in a university. I just expect that everyone will regulate themselves and will find the lectures interesting enough to come to the lectures. Right? That's all I can really tell you. Now, as you can see from the camera at the back of the room, this course is being video streamed, and all of these lectures will be made available to you, and they're available to you for the entirety of the quarter. So it takes typically up to 24 hours for a lecture to be posted. And I have long allowed that. There's only a minuscule number of professors who allow their courses to be video streamed. It's less than 1% of all the professors on this campus. But I have allowed all my courses to be video streamed. And in fact, I have a YouTube channel that you can actually access many of the other courses. Because, I don't accept the view that what a professor says that the professor has some kind of intellectual copyright which they need to guard, or that, well, what if a student, goes back and finds something objectionable? Well, I think that one has to be candid about what one's doing, and one should be transparent. So you have access to all the lectures, and you should make use of them. That is not an excuse not to come to class, however, because lectures are meant to really, the videos that I should say, are meant to supplement my lectures, in the sense that I think that there's a different, aura, if I may use the word, and a different impression when you hear the lecture as opposed to viewing it on tape later on. All right? But I'm just letting you know that these lectures are available to you, and you just have to go to the Bruincast site, and you'll be able to access them over there, and you can just log on to your my UCLA account, and you can access it through the course website as well. The last time this course was taught was 2014. The syllabus is not identical. There are portions of it which are identical, but they're entirely new portions. And you might find that some of those lectures are useful to you as well, because the accent is quite different every time. That sometimes when I'm speaking, and generally I'll speak without notes. I have the notes, but I don't usually view them very much. And so I might run off on a stream which might be a little different than what I did in 2014. So you might find those lectures useful as well as you think about how to prepare for your exam and how to prepare for your paper requirement. Which brings me to the formal requirements of the course. The formal requirements are very simple. I hope you all had a look at the syllabus. I did send a welcome email to the class about, I think, 2 days ago. And the formal requirements are that you have to do one paper, one short paper, roughly 4 to 5 pages, double-spaced. You will get a set of prompts from me by the end of week 3. So that gives you roughly 15 days or so to go over the prompts and select one and start writing your notes and start preparing for the paper. All right. And that accounts for 30% of the grade. And then there's one final exam, which is a take-home exam. Okay, and when it's a take-home exam, it means quite obviously that you can access anything. You can access your class notes, you can go to the lectures that are available through Bruincast, your textbooks, whatever the case may be, outside sources. And what will be the nature of that final exam? It'll be an essay exam. There's no ID questions, nothing of that. I've never believed in that. I'm not going to give you a map and say identify this or that city. No, you'll just get essay questions, and you'll get 7 essay questions, and you'll answer 4. The syllabus tells you exactly the nature of that exam. So these questions will be divided into 3 sections. Section 1, you get 3 questions, and you answer 2. Okay? So there's a little bit less choice there. Section 2, you get 2 questions, you answer 1. And section 3, you get 2 questions, and you answer 1. So you answered a total of 4 questions out of 7. You're expected to write approximately 2 to 2.5 pages double-spaced for each question. So your exam should be in the neighborhood of 10 pages. If it runs over, don't worry. Do not send me an email beforehand saying, well, if I run over to 11 pages, I'm letting you know right now. That's perfectly fine. If you run over a page, 2 or 3 even, I doubt many of you will run over. I've taught here long enough to know that that's not the problem, usually. Okay? All right? So that's essentially what the requirements are as far as the formal requirements of the class. Yes?
Final timed exam?
It's a take-home exam. We get 1 week to write the exam. 1 week. Yeah. Because I expect coherent, legible, thoughtful essays. Right? And so if you get it in class, a 3-hour, apart from the fact that I have to figure out your scribble, just as you would have to figure out my scribble, that's a problem always. I mean, you will have some problem reading my handwriting, I'm certain, when you get the paper back. And I know I will have the problem reading some of your handwriting. But other than that, the 3-hour in-class exam has never seemed to me to be, and I don't care how they do it in the sciences, but I'm just telling you that this seems to me to be a much more intelligent way to do it, is to allow you to be thoughtful and reflective about what you're writing, Okay, so 1 week, I think, is ample, generous time. All right, and you will get the exam emailed to you on the last day of classes, last day of this class. So after the last lecture, shortly thereafter, you will get the exam emailed to you. Okay. Any other questions thus far? Yes.
How much percent of the
final? 60. So I'm going to get to the remaining 10% in just a moment. Okay, so 30% for the short paper, what you can call a midterm paper if you want, and then 60% for the final exam. Now, let me mention a few other things. The use of iPhones or any smartphones or any phone of any kind is not permitted. Just put your phone away. If I see anyone texting or anything, I will just immediately deduct, without explanation, a full letter grade. As simple as that. You just do not need the phone, during the classroom. Now, there will be PowerPoint slides, none today, because today is the introductory lecture, but there will be PowerPoint slides in every lecture. And these PowerPoint slides will be posted every 3 weeks. Okay, I'm not going to post them every week. I'm going to post them every 3 weeks. And for example, before you write your paper, all the slides up to that point will have been posted. Okay, and similarly, of course, when you have the final exam, all the slides would have been posted before that time. So you don't need your phone, in other words, because sometimes I've been told, well, we need to capture the PowerPoint slide. No, you don't need to do that. Okay, very simple. Computers, fine. I don't have a problem with it, but I'm going to request you not to be doing numerous other things, except taking notes. And I do not want anyone here to be doing instant fact-checking and then raising their hand. So if I say something which you find implausible, let's say, or you say, oh, really? Is it the case that India has more Muslims than, almost every other country, barring Indonesia, for example, and Pakistan, and then someone here might already have done a little fact checking. You raise your hand. Oh, no. This is just restrain yourself. That's not what the use of the computer is for in the classroom. It's strictly for taking notes, and that's what you should be using it for. There is a writing center. It's mentioned on the syllabus. I encourage those of you who feel that they need to go there to call them up. And I'm talking about not the social sciences, I'm talking about the history writing center. It's staffed by graduate students, and they will assist you with your paper. They will assist you, for example, and I'm letting you know beforehand, you can even go to them for the final exam. They will not tell you, of course, how to write your answer. They're not going to, because they don't know anything about the substance of, but with respect to grammar, syntax, punctuation, organization of the paper, perhaps if the graduate student who's your writing mentor at that point feels that there is not enough clarity in your expression, they might advise you how to construct the sentence differently, right? So I encourage you to do that if you think you need to take that assistance. If you're a student with a learning disability, of course, strictly confidential, you write to me and you will get a response, but I'm just letting you know beforehand that you have to be registered with what is called the Center for Accessible Education, and that's when all the other things will kick in, extra time for the exam, so forth. But that doesn't really apply in a course of this kind because you have a take-home final, which is 1 week. But if somebody really needed, for reasons such as having a documented learning disability, more time, then you just go and register with the Center for Accessible Education, and I'll be able to accommodate you without any problem whatsoever. Okay? Email use. This is something I've just instituted as of this year. There is email abuse as well. And I can tell you, I'm sure all of you get lots of emails too, but I can tell you that as a faculty member, particularly with someone who has my own YouTube channel and my own blog and all of these kinds of things, there's just a deluge amount of emails. And I don't want you to email me for anything which is answered on the syllabus. Do not email me to inform me that you have a cough or a cold and you can't come to class. I'm not taking attendance anyhow, all right? And you don't need to inform me. And then, typically there'll be an email, well, I'm not able to come. What can I do to make up? Well, it's very simple. Go watch the video because it's available, right? So don't send me a superfluous email. If you want to raise an intellectual matter, I'm happy to get an email from you. I give you an interpretation of Gandhi and you want to dispute that, send me an email and you'll get a reply. I can guarantee you that. But I'm not going to reply to you if you ask me, what is a reading for next week or this or that. No, henceforth I'm not going to do that. All right, so I'm just again advising you that I think we should all be, we should use these things with discretion. It's not for me to advise you about how to use other digital media with discretion or to use it at all or not. That's not my brief, but my brief is to make sure that you don't send me emails that are really unnecessary, all right? All right, now 2-3 other matters, and that will also take us to the remaining 10% of the grade, okay? So I do have a blog. It's mentioned on the syllabus, and you have a few readings from the blog on the syllabus, required readings. Okay, so it's vinelal.wordpress.com. At the moment there are about 200 essays on it. So all these blog entries are essays. They're about, between 1,000 and 2,200 words, and the average is about maybe 1,200, 1,500 words. They are not necessarily all on India. And I don't expect you to devote, hours and hours to the blog. No, but you do have specific readings. And one of the reasons I've included them is that because on certain subjects, there are obviously 1,000 people who have done some work of interpretation. So let's say, for example, Gandhi. Okay, I mean, it's a mountain of literature on him. It's an industry, right? And if I pick 2 of my essays out of the million things that have been published, you could very well say to yourself, I mean, I'm sure you're not really thinking along lines, but you might think to yourself, man, this person has quite a lot of ego. He's assigned, 7 essays of his own, But part of the reason they've been assigned is because, of course, I do think I have a distinctive standpoint on a certain issue, but also because you are taking a class with me, and so that helps you better understand my perspective, which is what you are obviously receiving here. Right? You're not receiving some detached view, you're receiving a particular interpretation. And I think it's important to highlight that, because you could go to Wikipedia for some of the things that I'm saying, but all you'll get there really is the bare bones. You're not going to get a certain political point of view or a certain scholarly point of view, which may be quite distinct. I mean, I think you would all agree that if Wikipedia could do all of that, then we really wouldn't have any use for universities, would we? Right? So what you're going to be getting is a certain kind of reading of contemporary South Asia. How do we read the modern Hindi film, for example? Right? How do we read the contemporary politics of India? And if I go back to the comments I had made earlier on about what it means to study South Asia, I mean, reflect on the fact that India, by the way, is going to have a general election which is going to begin on April 11th. All right, so that's less than 10 days from now. The election, however, unlike in the United States, where, as you know, it's on a November 4th, I think, if I remember correctly, right? It's on a November, one day in November, every 4 years, a presidential election. In India, the election is staggered over a month. It's staggered over a month because the electorate is huge. So for this election, it is estimated that 880 million people are entitled to vote. 880 million. And it is by far the largest exercise in democracy in the world. And yes, you can put the word democracy in quotation marks, but of course my view is you should put it in quotation marks even here. And not simply because somebody called Donald J. Trump is occupying the White House, right? But I would say long before that you have to put the word democracy in quotation marks, because we can always question, I'll get to you in 1 second, we can always question exactly what nature of democracy it is and who is a democracy working for, right? So forth and so on. But at least in a formal sense, there is no question that what you do have in India, when you have the election that is going to be taking place while this course is going on, what is really the largest and most distinct and unique democratic exercise in the world. Right? So when we are thinking of India, these kinds of considerations really begin to loom large, and the blog essays will point to some of these kinds of aspects of South Asian politics, life, and society. You had a question?
Of that 880 million, do we have any projections about what the expected participation is going to be?
I would say it's going to be in the neighborhood of about 650 to 700 million. Yeah. There's something very interesting about Indian elections that I'm going to alert you to right now, okay? Which is that in the United States, it can be argued that those who are educated are much more likely to vote. That has been shown by every survey and every study that has been done. That those who are educated, those who belong to the middle class, are much more likely to vote. Now, there may be lots of reasons for that. We're not going to spend the rest of the afternoon trying to dissect American democracy, but it's important to understand that some of the reasons for that have to do with, for example, the fact that there may be a large number of people in the working class, whether they're black or white or Hispanic or Asian or whatever the case may be, who might feel that they just don't have enough of an investment in this thing called a democratic election. Okay? This exercise called an election. Because you know that the United States, of all the democracies in the West, has by far the lowest percentage of people who vote. By far. In Australia, just so that you understand, you are required by law to vote. By law. If you don't vote, you can be imprisoned, fined, and election day is a holiday. That's another reason why, by the way, the rate at which people vote is much lower here, because you've got a working class person, you're going into work at 6 o'clock in the morning, you're coming back at 6 in the evening. You know, you're just too exhausted by the end of the day. And of course, you know, in states such as Texas and Mississippi, there's been voter suppression. To my mind, there's no question that there's voter suppression going on. Polls being closed early on, for example, in many districts, right? All ways in which the democratic will is being subverted. In India, what's interesting is the educated do not vote. Absolutely the case. And when I say they don't vote, I mean that proportionately. Of course there are those who are going to vote. But the working class, the poor people, are much more likely to vote in India. And that suggests to us that the ballot has made a difference to the lives of people, or at least they think it has. That if you belong to a group of people known as the Dalits, about whom you're going to hear a lot more as we move into the quarter, right? Which is the Dalits, you can number them at approximately 200 million. One of the things you're going to get used to is you're going to get these numbers and 50, 100, 150, 200. Well, you know, you've got 1.3 billion people living in India. Don't forget that. Okay? So if these figures seem outlandish to you, they're not. But so we're saying roughly 200 million people who might be Dalits. Just take a nice round figure. And one of the things that the Dalits have realized, so these are people who are at the rock bottom of Indian society, one of the things they realize is that, well, one of the ways in which you attain upward mobility is through the ballot box. That's how you acquire power. There may be other ways to acquire power too. Maybe guns is one way to acquire power, and there may be those who go in that direction. But the ballot box means something. Okay? So going back to the blog essays, you're going to get about 7 or 10 of them, and they're very short. They're about 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 words each. Because, you know, when you look through the syllabus, you might think to yourself, well, you know, there are 4 pages of reading, but a lot of the readings are very, very short. Okay? Now, as far as the remaining 10% is concerned, basically, the way it works is this. So 30% of the grade is taken up by your paper, the short paper, 60% by the final exam. The remaining 10% for most of you will remain neutral. That is that, you know, if you're coming to class and you're sort of doing what, you know, you ought to be doing, which is doing the readings and all of that, and I have no reason to suspect that you haven't been coming to class. There are some people whose absence becomes conspicuous in various ways, such as, for example, and even after I've said that, this same problem occurs, such as the failure to pick up your midterm paper for 2 weeks from me. Well, then I know you're really absent, you know, right? So, but in some cases, you can make that 10% count in your favor by taking part in class discussions and being active on the blog site, because then I know you're reading the material. So you read an essay by me, write a comment, you know, and it can be a critical comment, by the way. I'm not at all averse to critical comments. You know, you don't get you know, just so long as one observes the protocols of not using abusive language and all of that, which I'm not going to expect any of you to indulge in that, you know, but other than that, you know, if you have a critical comment or some kind of observation, by all means share it, but that's essentially how it goes. All right. There is also a pedagogic website, but that's strictly for your use, which is mentioned on the syllabus, which I had set up years ago. And it's simply called southasia.ucla.edu, and it has about 500 articles having to do with India, all written by myself. Okay, and they're on politics, art, architecture, cinema, different aspects of an Indian diaspora, some on Pakistan, so on and so forth. All right. Now I'm just reviewing to make sure that I haven't skipped anything. Yes, there's one further matter, and then I'll get into the syllabus. And that last matter is the readings for the course. So the readings for the course, which, and of course that's a segue into the actually going into the syllabus itself, but the vast majority of readings are online, and all you have to do to access them is obviously just go to my UCLA, log into the course website, and you'll be able to access them. There is a novel which I have assigned. I'm not one of those who believes that when you take a history class, you only read history or something called history. The literature, film, all of that can be and not just a useful, but it can be an insightful and interesting way to enter into a society. And in this case, I've assigned a very contemporary novel by Neil Mukherjee, written in absolutely glowing, fabulous English. And it's really about the underside, the underbelly of India. So, you know, but it's mentioned in the syllabus. And that book you really should buy, because there's really no other way to read that book. I mean, you could do it on Kindle if you want. But the book has been ordered for you, and it's at the bookstore, or should be at the bookstore. Has anyone been to the bookstore here? No. And was it there?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Is that the only book that's there, I'm assuming? That's... Yes, yeah. So that's the only book that ought to be there, because unless they decided to order things that weren't required. So there is another book which is mentioned on the syllabus. I'm only here speaking about the books rather than the articles, because I just want to dispense with the matter of what the books are. And I just want to alert you to week 5. There is a book called This Divided Island by Samanth Subramanian, and it gives you a it doesn't give you the page numbers, but I will assign page numbers from that. Initially, I thought I would have you read the whole book, but I read the whole book during the spring break myself and decided that rather than have you read all of it, I'm going to just have you read excerpts from it. So those excerpts will be posted shortly. But 95% of the readings are already in place. If you've actually gone to the syllabus and looked at the links, you'll see that you can download all of them as PDF files. All right. Any questions for me regarding anything I've said thus far? Because I'm going to take the remaining portion of the time to go over the syllabus with you. And while I go over the syllabus, it will be an occasion to begin to start reflecting on what we're really going to be doing and what it means to study South Asia. So any questions? All right. So week 1. The remaining lecture, which is on Thursday, is going to offer you an account of the years preceding the partition and independence of 1947. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the negotiations that led to the independence of India and the partition of India. Because I think at least some of you in this room recognize that many of the problems that persist today, such as, for example, the dispute between India and Pakistan. And if you were reading the news last month, or rather I should say February, because now it's early April already, you know that there was a what's called a terrorist attack on Indian troops in Kashmir. And 40 Indian soldiers were killed, and then India decided to retaliate by actually launching an airstrike where they crossed what is called the line of control, So the line of control is the de facto border between India and Pakistan. And they hadn't crossed the line of control for decades. So they crossed the line of control, and then Pakistan shot down one, possibly two jets. An Indian pilot was captured, and then he was returned to India after a few days. So, and if you read the newspapers here, they were all talking about the possibility of yet another war. There's a very, very recent piece by me, which should be coming out tomorrow. It's not on the syllabus, in the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, which they had commissioned me to do on India and Pakistan and the present phase of the dispute. And I'll just send you the URL, and if you'd like to have a little bit more detail and perspective on that, you're welcome to read it. But in any case, I mentioned this because 1947, one of the outcomes of that partition was the unsettled state of Kashmir, which continues, of course, down to the present day. All right? So that's one reason among many why I think it's important that we understand exactly what transpired in the few years preceding 1947, and then what exactly was a partition about, what were its consequences, and why it is one of the most calamitous events in modern history anywhere in the world. All right, and that segment will conclude with a discussion of the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi, generally known as Mahatma Gandhi, in January 1948. So just 6 months after the independence of India, the architect of Indian independence was assassinated. All right, so that's going to be the lecture on Thursday. Week 2, India since independence, I'm just going to give you a critical overview. And this critical overview will look at such things as, well, how does India compare with, let's say, the rest of the world with respect to, for example, economic well-being? Okay? Why is it that 70 years after independence, a little over 70 years after independence, India still has a very low literacy rate? I mean, the official figure in India is 70% literacy. I don't believe it for a moment. I don't believe it for a moment. I think if it's even 35 or 40%, I'd be astonished, because to the best of my knowledge and awareness of what happens in India, it's nowhere near 70 or 75%. And here I'm not distinguishing between literacy rates between men and women, and between urban areas and rural areas. That's what we'll do in that segment. We'll look at it in somewhat greater detail. Why is it that Cuba, right, had a literacy rate that shot up to 95% within 5 years of the independence of Cuba, the liberation of Cuba from Batista and, the capitalist overlords? Why Nicaragua literacy rates became very high? Is it because where there's a will, as it were? Is it because, well, these were countries that had what you might call communist or left-wing revolutions, and that a lot more emphasis was paid on such things as literacy? On the other hand, if you look at Indian universities, so there's a whole set of institutions known as the IITs. So IIT, in India, by the way, they love acronyms. This is a very simple one. They love them. They adore them. Just randomly go to Indian newspapers and you'll see NCRT, as though we all know what that means, They'll have the 10 acronyms in a 500-word article. So IIT is the Indian Institute of Technology, and now there are about 15 of them. There used to be 6 or 7. The graduates of these institutions were people who went on to do graduate work at Harvard, UCLA, MIT. If you've ever thought about how many computer scientists are Indians, dime a dozen it seems, right? Silicon Valley is chock full of them, as they say. I know it's a cliche, but it is chock full of them, actually. And many of these are people who came out of the IITs. Right, so you find that institutions of higher education, the government invested money, but If you're talking about secondary and primary education, that was not the case. Why is it that more than 70 years after independence, and I think we have to put it bluntly, that more than 70 years after independence, well over half the country is suffering from malnutrition? I don't really care what Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, says about India, launching satellites and this and that, or shooting down satellites. If you read the news recently, they shot down, entered an elite club of 3 other countries in the world that have shot down a satellite. Not that India has hordes of satellites that they can shoot down. I think we should ask them, they probably wasted $100 million shooting down one of their own satellites. But yeah, the only 3 countries that can do that are the US, Russia, and China. And India has become the 4th country. So they're busy doing that, but a good portion of the country is suffering from malnutrition. We have to be candid about it, right? So when we take a critical overview, we're going to be looking at economic well-being. We're going to look at environmental issues. The UN has just released a report. 15 of the 20 most polluted cities in the world are in India. 15 out of the 20, and 18 out of the 20 are in South Asia. So Pakistan and Bangladesh are catching up with India. Let's just make our cities more polluted because it shows there's more development going on. This is lunatic thinking, frankly, but that's how it is. Right? So, of course, that's not the only side. There are lots of other interesting things happening too. But we're going to do a political, economic, environmental kind of overview, try to get a sense of South Asia as a whole. Week 3. Now, here's an important note. I will confirm this for you by this Thursday. Week 3 and week 4, we're going to reverse. We're going to reverse because I expect to have one of the world's most distinguished filmmakers in this class on the 16th. Okay, his name is Anand Patwardhan. He's India's most well-known documentary filmmaker and one of the most distinguished filmmakers in the world. And he's going to be screening a new 4-hour film of his at the Indian Film Festival of Los Angeles on the 16th, which is a Sunday. I can send you details of that. So there's a IFLA Festival, Indian Film Festival of Los Angeles, which is going to be that weekend. And he has a 4-hour documentary called Reason, and he's going to come and speak in class on the 16th. Okay? And if he does that, which I'm going to be able to confirm for you in a couple of days, we're going to just reverse the readings because what he's going to be speaking on is really more germane to the syllabus for week 4, not week 3. Okay? So we would just reverse the readings. But at the moment, I'm just giving you the layout as it is. And so week 3, development and well-being, then we're going to have even a more detailed consideration of some of the economic history of modern India. We're also going to look at such things as neoliberalization policies. So now it's not simply a matter of looking at such things as literacy rates, development rates, or how India has done according to various kinds of universal indices. But we're going to really look at also larger questions about economic justice and economic injustice in India, Pakistan, in that part of the world. One of this is a cliche, but the cliche is just useful as a provocation. But you know that the most expensive private home in the world is in India. Okay? When it was built, at that time, almost 10 years ago, its value was $1 billion. It's the private home of Mukesh Ambani. It's 23 floors. Okay, 4 floors are just for parking. One floor is a helicopter, array of helicopter pads and all of that. And it overlooks one of the world's largest slums. Delectable view, right? So you stand there and you can just look down on that slum. I mean, everyone in that slum could be put into that building and there'd be ample room, But that's how it is. Again, And so that's, as I said, a cliche, but that's very often pointed to as a way of illustrating the enormous gap, which is, I think, a worldwide problem. It's an enormous problem in the US too. Growing economic injustice. Right? The concentration of wealth in a few hands. The 15 wealthiest people in the United States own more than 50% of the entire wealth of this country. So this is not a problem that is particular to India, but in India it is certainly is one of the most egregious examples of that. And again, the situation is not any different in the rest of South Asia. It's just that Nepal doesn't really have billionaires of the magnitude that obviously India does, you know, and Pakistan and Bangladesh have a lot fewer as well, and these are obviously much smaller countries in comparison to India. But we want to sort of also look at things like neoliberalization policies and globalization. What does that mean? What has it done for India? And what has it not done for India? And then week 4, politics and the Indian state, identity and communalism. So here we're going to really look at the state in India. We're going to look at what we understand by politics, which includes not just party politics. It doesn't include things simply like an electoral democracy and the exercise that I spoke to you about having an election. But it also includes things like grassroots movements, right? We're going to pay more attention to them later on as well, but it includes grassroots movements and it includes politics from the ground up. But it also includes such things as tensions between Hindus and Muslims, what is known in India as communalism. And I'm going to explain that at much greater length when we get to that subject. There'll be intimations of that in my next lecture because that was obviously critical in the development of Pakistan, right? The whole idea of communal identity. But that's what week 4 is going to be largely. It's going to be a set of readings which will help you understand the role of the Indian state. What is the relationship of the state to the people? What kind of responsibility does it bear to the people? Right? What kind of, and how has it exercised this responsibility? And what is the nature of the Indian Constitution? A great Indian writer just published a piece yesterday, and he said, well, you know, will anyone in India take offense if I say that the holy book for me is the Constitution of India? Not the Bhagavad Gita if you're a Hindu, or the Quran if you're a Muslim, right? But the Constitution, because India does have a Constitution. And the Supreme Court of India has sometimes upheld the Constitution in the most interesting ways. And the Supreme Court in the last 1 year in particular has been very active in India. And one of the things that the Supreme Court did, which was just a few months ago, that's one of my blog essays, by the way, 2 blog essays on that, is they overturned the most critical part of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. And what is the Indian Penal Code? This is where colonialism comes in. It goes back to the 1850s, when India was under colonial rule, so they established a penal code. Just, you know, you have a penal code here too, in the United States, right? And the Indian Penal Code, Section 377, a portion of that criminalized homosexuality. And so in India, until it was overturned, homosexual relations were the subject of criminal action by the state. And this act goes back to the British period. There's another section of it which they did not overturn, which is of no interest to, you know, to anyone at all, and no one has insisted on its being overturned, which basically criminalizes bestiality, relations between animals and sexual relations between animals and humans, and so on. But the main portion of it was overturned, and there was great rejoicing in the LGBT community, of course. You know, so this was all over the newspapers, even in the US. I mean, the New York Times, Washington Post, all of them had full-page articles on this. So when we look at politics and the Indian state, all of this is under that purview, right? How does the Supreme Court act in India? Is it much more of an interventionist court than the Supreme Court of the United States. And my submission to you is it is. And perhaps it ought to be, given the social conditions of India. But this is something we will consider at greater length at the right time. And then week 5, ethnic, racial, linguistic conflict, the case of Sri Lanka. So here we do look at another part of South Asia. I could have picked, obviously, any number of conflicts in India where the literature, we could have looked at the literature there. But I think I wanted to pick Sri Lanka partly because it's a way of entering into other parts of South Asia, but also because Sri Lanka is a country that is predominantly, not solely, but predominantly Buddhist, with a large minority of Hindus and Muslims as well. And there are some Christians as well in Sri Lanka. And I think the conflict in Sri Lanka was particularly troublesome for a lot of reasons. Partly because there has long been the view that Buddhism is not hospitable to these kinds of things. So how did a country with a Buddhist majority and a country where Buddhist monks took part in the genocide, frankly, right? So that's the reason why it's interesting. But it's also because the major terrorist group that was involved in the Civil War, and it is a terrorist group, I mean, which is not to say that the Tamils, the group that they represented, do not have legitimate aspirations. They do. But the group that was agitating on their behalf, known as the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or Tamil State, was a group that actually pioneered many of the methods used by terrorist groups worldwide in subsequent decades. They were the first group to deploy suicide bombers 30 years ago, long before ISIS was born, long before Al-Qaeda came into existence. They were the first to use the internet to do fundraising. They were the first to send child soldiers into the field. It's astonishing the degree to which LTTE pioneered. I mean, this is not the best use of the word, right? You don't want to be pioneering forms of genocide and oppression and all of that, but that's what they did. But they were the first group of that kind to really deploy all of these methods. And the case of Sri Lanka offers a test case of what happens when the legitimate aspirations of a group get undermined by their own people. You know? So that's what we want to do, is we want to look at one study here, one case, and then try to extrapolate from that. Week 6, Dalits and Adivasis. So Dalits I spoke to you about before. So they said this is a group of people who are at the lowest rung of what is called the caste system. Adivasis is a word for the tribal population in India, also numbering something in the neighborhood of 150 million, 175 million. You know, these are the people who are at the margins of Indian society. And I want to say to you that anything that you learn about them, which is really going to be minuscule, how much are you going to learn about them really, you know, with 1 or 2 sets of readings and 1 or 2 lectures. But anything that you learn from them, you can think about whether the same conditions exist for Aboriginal populations and tribal populations elsewhere in the world. Because I would argue, yes, there is something that is common to all these people. That, you know, for example, if you look at Burma, okay? So Burma, by the way, is another, or Myanmar, as it is otherwise known, and that's the official name now. So that's another country, by the way, which is, we're not going to really look at, but, you know, it shares borders, of course, with Bangladesh as well. And, you know, if you look at Myanmar, and you look at its capital city, Rangoon, for decades, the people who dominated the economic life of Rangoon were all Indians. The currency is a rupee, which is the Indian currency. The Indian rupee, by the way, was used in large parts of East Africa. It was the dominant currency in places like Kenya, the whole east coast of Africa. Okay? Right? And that's partially because many of these Indian communities were trading communities which really dispersed in very significant portions of the world. Right? But I was telling you about Burma or Myanmar, and you know, Myanmar has a large number of tribal populations. And all these tribal populations, almost all of them, sit atop huge mineral wealth. And you find that to be the case in many parts of the world. Another country where that's true is Australia, where you have enormous mineral deposits, but these are all largely in what is called the outback. I don't know if there's any Australian here, or if you know the language that I'm talking about. Okay, anyhow, so it's called the outback. And you know, a large part of Australia is the outback, because if you've ever been there, or have ever studied it to even a nominal degree, you know that 95% of the population really lives within 50 miles of the coast, and it's a huge coast, right, running all the way from the northeast, Queensland, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and then you keep on going all the way to Perth, to the west coast, right? It's a continent and an island unto itself, and everyone virtually lives within 50 miles, 25 miles really of the coast. But the rest of it is all the outback. And this is where you have the Aboriginal populations. And this is where you have the mineral wealth. And from the point of view of mining corporations, from the point of view of corporate and capitalist elites, from the point of view of the state, it's just there for the taking. Unfortunately, you have that's how they think. Unfortunately, you have these tribal populations sitting there. They don't know what to do with them. That's how they think of it. And that's exactly the case in India, where you have these Adivasi groups, Aboriginal groups. And if you're liberal, then you have this view, which is a cliched view, but it is, Aboriginal groups always knew how to take care of Mother Nature, and everything was hunky-dory. Well, everything was not hunky-dory either, I can tell you. But yes, they were not exploitative in the way in which modern society is just exploitative. Because from the point of view of a corporation, all this land just exists there to be mined, tapped. That's all it's there for. And if there are people, they need to be removed or they need to be eliminated. And that is generally the theory of extraction, And that is the basis on which the Indian state has proceeded. And now, of course, you have environmental activists, and you have other activists who try to safeguard the rights of the Adivasi populations. And so it's a constant tug of war. And that's what we're going to be looking at here, is we're going to be looking at these marginalized groups, and then we're going to be looking at Dalits. What is the point of view with which they look at the Indian state? What does the Constitution mean to them? How have they attempted to overcome centuries of discrimination and liabilities? All right. Week 7, migrants, laborers, displacements. And that Neil Mukherjee novel is a very good illustration of that, because it's about a huge number of people in India who are basically between places. Okay, not between places from an elite standpoint. There are elites who are between places too. I love it when I read these novels written by Neil Mukherjee himself. If you ever read the blurb at the back, it'll always say, well, at the end of it, after all the awards, Rhodes Fellow or whatever, and then he divides his time between London, Paris, and New York. Well, that's pretty cozy. You got divides your time between London, Paris, and trot from one home to another in these great metropolitan centers. But there are other people who are shifting around, moving around, and they're not moving around between Paris, London, and New York. What they're moving around is from one crummy job to another, getting underpaid and exploited by whoever they work with, right? This is the shifting migrant population, and there are tens of millions of them. Tens of millions of them. You have that in this country too, with the working class. I mean, you go to elite neighborhoods, you know, Beverly Hills, Bel Air, in the San Fernando Valley. I mean, who's cleaning the houses, right? That's what we're speaking about. So we're going to be looking at some of these people, their lives. And then we're going to look in week 8 at women in South Asia. As, of course, they enter into the picture in other respects too. They in week 7, for example, or Dalits and Adivasis. But there are particular problems, particular disabilities from which women suffer, obviously. But there's also a women's movement. So in India, in 1947, at the time of independence, there was universal franchise, right? So everyone could vote. There were no property restrictions. There were no restrictions on women being able to vote. They had universal franchise. The first election was 1951. Independence was 1947, but the first election was 1951, the first general election. And generally, barring some exceptions, there's an election every 5 years. There have been times when they haven't had it, when they imposed an emergency in 1975. So, you know, the circumstances can vary in at certain times. And in all of these elections, of course, women have been able to vote. But that's not, of course, the only thing that we are interested in. We're interested in why is it, for example, that literacy rates are substantially lower for women than they are for men, particularly in parts of rural India, you know, right? But we're also interested, not just again in data, we're interested in trying to understand what feminism might mean in India. Okay? What would a feminist perspective in India be? Would it be identical to the perspective here? And of course, to some degree, you can anticipate that it wouldn't be, which is one reason why we speak of feminisms. And you know that in the US, for those of you in women's studies, you know, there's this whole idea of women of color. The reason why that phrase is used is precisely because there is an understanding that white women have their own entitlements and privileges, and that may be something of an obstacle for understanding the position of women of color, right? So I'm giving it to you in very broad brushstrokes at this point, right? Because we're just looking at the syllabus as the overview. But those would be some of the considerations that you'd have to think about when you're looking at the position of women in India. How do they occupy the public space? So last evening, my wife and I watched the first 3 episodes. I very seldom watch Netflix because you know what it is, right? When you get onto it, then there's like 50 episodes and then you squander your whole week. You know, forget about teaching, writing, reading, you know. So I very seldom. But there is a new serial, and because I'm teaching this course, I decided, okay, I'm going to make an exception. It's called Delhi Crime. Delhi Crime, 7 episodes, okay? 7 episodes. And this episode, it's still 10 after 3, so are you in the next class? Maybe. Well, you ought to know, right, which class you're in. This is South Asian history? Yeah. So I think you need to wait until the class is over. Thank you. These are some of the protocols that have changed over the years that I've been teaching. People just walk in and out, you know, right? So this serial, Delhi Crime, is based on the notorious rape case that took place in Delhi in 2012. Made the headlines all over the world for all the wrong reasons, but it did. And it basically shows you really the way in which the police work to crack the case, what is some of the politics, what is the life of the police like, and of course, you know, what are some of the general currents of thought in a society. You know, what is a definition for a democracy? I'll tell you one definition. I mean, it's not in any law book or in any constitution. But if a woman can't walk down the streets safely at any time of the day or night, then you have to think whether it's a democracy or not. You could say that, right? And so that's, I think, the kind of consideration that we're going to have to really think about. What is a place of women in the public sphere, more broadly, which cannot be captured simply through statistics, and data. We have to try to understand what are the assumptions about, the place they occupy, about their role, and of course questions about sexuality, masculinity, femininity. So I'm going to attempt to look at some of that in week 8. Week 9, the Hindi film, Bollywood, as it's known. So we're going to have because I think that today it's inescapable that one cannot think about modern India without thinking about Indian cinema. And for that, you're going to watch one film. It's a film on which I wrote a whole book. And so you'll read that book. It's a very short book. It's a 1975 film, which is one of the classics of commercial Indian cinema. The film is called Diwar, the wall. And it has been the most famous line or exchange in that film, which I will not tell you right now, no spoilers here, but that has been subject to so many parodies I cannot even enumerate them. You'd need an encyclopedia to enumerate all the parodies of that most famous exchange in that film. So when we get to that, you'll know what it is. But that will be an occasion to look at street culture as well, public culture. And then week 10 will be kind of reflections on India's future, the problems of Hindu nationalism, globalization, and what place India occupies in the world. And why is there, for example, certain kinds of anxieties in the Indian middle class about India, right? I mean, how else does one explain all this, elation and pride that people have because they shot down a satellite, right? I mean, there has to be some anxiety there. And so we're going to try to understand the nature of that anxiety in the last lecture. All right.